The Florentine Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore is the main religious monument in the city. Started in 1296, it is an iconic example of Gothic architecture, and for many, the Florentine Duomo is a must-see in Florence. Yet, is it really worth waiting in a long queue that you can find in front of the church in the high season from April to October? There are many ways how to explore the cathedral and the cathedral complex. Let me guide you through the Florentine Duomo and through this iconic monument. The Florentine Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, substituted a much older church that used to stand in the same location starting from the 5th century, the Church of Santa Reparata. During the 13th century, when Florence reached the peak of its demographic and economical development, this old small church was not representative enough to symbolize the power and the wealth of the city. And so, in 1296, the city invested in the new construction designed by the Florentine architect Arnolfo di Cambio. As it often happened in the Middle Ages, one life was not enough to conclude the construction of a new church. After Arnolfo's death, the main architect of the cathedral became Giotto, the famous painter who became the designer of the Florentine bell tower that stands next to the cathedral itself. And then it was Francesco Talenti who took over the works and decided to enlarge Arnolfo's initial project. This decision, took in the mid of the 14th century, was not a good choice because the enlarged church started having problems with the construction of the dome. The works on the church itself finished by the end of the 14th century, but then the whole project was stopped because the people of Florence had no idea how to conclude the cathedral with the construction of a gigantic dome. The problems related to the construction of the dome depended on the size of the big opening at the crossing of the two naves of the church. The drum supporting the dome arrives to 52 meters and the opening inside is wide for 45.5 meters. The size of this huge opening rendered impossible the use of the technique of dome constructing used at that time, which included the so-called centering, a scaffolding in the shape and the size of the future dome that worked as a support for the bricks. The simple brick dome of this immense size would be simply too heavy and it would collapse under its own weight. And the Florentine people knew that very well. This is why the construction of the cathedral stopped for several years before Filippo Brunelleschi actually stepped in and suggested his innovative solution to this project. Brunelleschi's dome is the most fascinating part of the Florentine cathedral. Brunelleschi built a double-shelled dome, meaning that he encapsulated a smaller internal dome with an external cover joining the two domes together. This system allowed him to get rid of the centering. The two domes together resisted against the gravity and worked together. He reinforced the resistance of the walls of the two domes using a Roman building technique, using the herringbone brick laying. Because the two domes were already standing up during the construction, Brunelleschi could attach the scaffoldings to the already built part of the dome. If you look carefully on the external part of the dome, you will find big black squares with the big openings inside. These are the traces of the attachment points for the balconies stretched all around the dome, on which the builders of the cathedral were actually standing to build the gigantic dome. The dome was concluded in 1436 and the cathedral was consecrated and inaugurated by the Pope. It was a great feast for the people of Florence, also showing the innovative technology that Florence managed to develop in order to build the dome. Brunelleschi is in fact the designer not only of the dome but also of the big crane and hoisting machinery that stood at the center of the cathedral during the construction of the dome, that helped them to manage all the weights that had to be hoisted up to the builders who worked on the scaffoldings. The dome is really a miracle of the Renaissance architecture. If you want to explore the complex of the Florentine Cathedral, my advice is that you actually buy the ticket to enter not only inside the church, but to visit also the Florentine Baptistery and the Cathedral Museum. And this is because the cathedral itself is rather plain inside. Many of the precious monuments that used to decorate the church in the past were moved with time to the Cathedral Museum, where they are preserved today. And so it's not really worth waiting hours in a long queue to enter and to see the church only without exploring the complex history deeper. With your ticket, you will be able to visit not only the church but also the archaeological site beneath it, where you will discover the remains of the previous church, the Church of Santa Reparata, that stood in the same spot before the big cathedral was built. You will explore the baptistry and the Cathedral Museum. If you want, you can add to your visit some of the climbs. You can climb to the top of the Florentine Bell Tower or climb the dome and see Florence from the top. If you visit the cathedral with the ticket, you will have the access to the archaeological site beneath it. This is a very fascinating place where you can discover the beautiful mosaic floor from the 5th century that used to decorate the floor of the very first church standing in this very spot. The floor actually includes also the list of the sponsors of this precious decoration, all men with Roman names who were already Christians and paid for the decoration of their Christian temple. A floor from the 5th century shows you clearly how Roman culture transformed and became Christian culture of the Middle Ages. One of the most interesting monuments inside of the cathedral, and one of my favorite monuments in Florence, is actually a unique clock designed in 1443 by the Florentine painter Paolo Uccello. If you look at it carefully, you will notice that it's very curious. First of all, the circle of the clock is divided in 24 little pieces, and it moves in the opposite direction to how we imagine clockwise movement today. The clock displays the so-called hora italica, so an ancient way of time measurement. First of all, the hours were of a different length depending on the time period and the season. Secondly, the day would start with the sunset, so the first hour was actually the hour of the sunset. And if you look at the clock today, you will notice that this clock is still today following this ancient method of time measurement, very unusual for us today. Those who enter the cathedral are definitely attracted by the beautiful fresco decoration that decorates Brunelleschi's dome from the inside. This decoration was made in the late 16th century. The frescoes were started by Giorgio Vasari, very important artist working for the Duke Cosimo I. Unfortunately, Vasari died soon after, and he was substituted by Federico Zuccari. Zuccari, who was a really good manager and was thinking also about the economical part of his work, and he changed the technique for the execution of his decorations, abandoning the good fresco, so the real fresco painting made on the fresh plaster, and passing on a dry fresco that is much quicker and less expensive. And this is why people of Florence didn't actually approve of what he's done, even if today we admire his decorations and look at them with amazement. Zuccari painted the scenes of the Last Judgment, the return of Christ that all the Christians await. And you will see the very violent scenes with the devils punishing the souls of the condemned, and Jesus surrounded by the saints and the bishops sitting in the upper part of the fresco. An interesting painting decorating the north wall of the cathedral is a painting from 1465 made by Domenico di Michelino that represents Dante with Florence and its Divine Comedy. It was commissioned by the government of Florence for the celebration of the bicentenary of the birth of the poet. The painting represents Dante standing outside of the walls of Florence with the city behind him and the three parts of the underworld described by Dante in the Divine Comedy next to him: the gate to the hell, the purgatory, and the paradise. This painting is an expression of worship of Dante and his Divine Comedy by the people of Florence. The people of Florence are also very proud of the fact that this important Italian poet actually comes from the city. They tend to forget that they actually exiled him and considered him an enemy, a public enemy, for such a long time before that. The north wall of the cathedral is also decorated by two painted monuments made during the 15th century in honor of the two mercenary knights, John Hawkwood and Niccolò da Tolentino. The horse monument to John Hawkwood was painted in 1436 by Paolo Uccello, and it's an interesting early example of a return to the classical idea that an important military leader can be worshipped with a horse monument. Uccello painted the lower part of the monument using a newly learned linear perspective, which was a geometrical method of the projection of depth on a surface. The upper part of the fresco instead features the horse from the profile, which was a solution used by the artist to avoid some more embarrassing points of view. If you want to visit the cathedral and the cathedral complex, you will find all the opening times in the description of this video. My advice is that if you want to climb to the top of Brunelleschi's dome, you book your ticket on the official website of the cathedral with large advance. As you can imagine, this is one of the most interesting things, most fun things to do in Florence, a very, very popular activity, and so the tickets are sold out with large advance. A guided tour of the cathedral complex is a very interesting experience, and so if you're interested in a guided tour of the Cathedral Museum and the Baptistery, contact us and you will find all the information in the description of this video.